welcome to the fifth game of the World Chess Championship. This is International Master Oladapo. I think this was an exchange French defense. Normally the French exchange is just a kind of like a peaceful opening, should I say, White is not looking to get any kind of serious advantage, just try to, get his pieces on good squares and see what happens. So let us see how this game went. And this wasn't just, I would say it was some kind of a fighting draw, not as much as a lot of a fight, but I mean, you could tell both players were trying to, get the advantage to make the, to get the advantage to shift to their own side of the board. So let's get right into the game. So the game started with e4, Gukesh was on the white side, and e6, and d4, d5. If we remember, the very first game that was played was a French defense. I think it was a classical variation where Gukesh played a very interesting knight e2, which is not normally played at that level. But here we're going for an exchange variation of the French defense. Captures on d5, captures back, knight to f3, develops the knight, keeping now the central squares. Knight to f6 develops his knight. Bishop to d3, the best square for the bishop, putting pressure on the pawn on h7. And c5, immediately blacks plays c5. I mean, multiple reasons. Taking is possible, c4 is possible. To force this bishop to a not so good square. White responded by saying, you know what, I like my bishop on d3. I want to maintain the d3 square, especially the b1, h7 diagonal. So I'm going to move my pawn to c3, defending the pawn with my pawn, and also claim the c2 for my bishop in case there's a move c4. c4 was playing the game. Bishop goes to c2, bishop to d6. Now, queen e2 is very interesting. Well, I don't know. I don't know why queen e2 is played. Normally, if you're trying to fight for a win, I think it's better to just castle. The rook belongs to e1, bishop goes to g5, knight b d2, knight f1, knight g3, trying to create some play. Queen e2 doesn't look like probably, let's say, Gukesh is just trying to get into the end game and just see what happens. Because for me, that's what I think the queen e2 is all about. Because after the move queen to e2, queen e7 is played and the queens were traded. Queen captures, king captures back, and castles. Rook to e8, rook to e1 check, king moves to f8, captures back, bishop to g5 develops the bishop to the knight square, knight b d7 protects the bishop, develops a piece, knight b d2 develops a piece. All the pieces are looking good. White has all his pieces developed, especially the minor pieces looking good, but black is yet to get his bishop on c8 in the game. But it's not such a problem. Of course, we don't want to get the bishop to either b7 or a6, because they're going to be blocked by the pawn c4 and d5. So it will make sense for this bishop to come to a diagonal such as here, something here, either to counter this guy or to put pressure on the knight on f3. So h6 is played, bishop goes to h4, knight to h5. Now g5 is possible, bishop takes, maybe knight can take. So what does white play here? White plays rook to e1 check, king goes to f8. Of course, it's very important for the king to stay on this side of the board and reserve the e8 square for the rook. Because after the exchange, the king is in the boot to come into the middle of the game as quick as possible. Because, of course, we're approaching the end game. So g4, very, well, it's a move. Knight to f4, bishop to g3 is played. Knight to b6. Releasing the bishop putting pressure on the pawn on g4. So how does white get to defend the pawn? He advances the pawn. So g5 is played, captures back, bishop to d7. Of course, it's very important you get your bishop to d7. Why? So that the rook on e8 can get into the game and participate. Knight come back to f3. Of course, keeping an eye on the e5 square to put pressure on the bishop on d7. Rook to e8 is played, knight to e5, captures back, knight to d3. That's a forced move because I'm not just attacking the pawn on b2 that is undefended, I'm also attacking the pawn on e5, even though it is defended twice. But there's an extra attack on the rook. So if the rook maintains the protection of the pawn on e5, b2 gets captured. So that means bishop has to take the knight, pawn takes back, f3. What's the point of f3? It's very important to start moving the king towards the center of the board. In every game of chess, once you start getting to the end game, it's time for your king to start approaching the center of the board. Pretty much an even position, although NG says slightly better for white. Knight goes to c4. We have to capture because it's going to be difficult to defend the pawn and the knight. So we must capture the knight on c4. Captures back. Now the interesting thing about this position, or one thing we should note about this position, is the fact that they both have opposite colored bishops. Black has the light square bishop, black has a dark square bishop. Unless you have an attacking chance or attacking chances, most of the time the game kind of fizzles out into a draw. So if this game ends in a draw, we will not so be surprised about it. Of course, what will be the strategy here if you're just trying to keep the position equal? If you have the white pieces, make sure all your pawn stays on the dark squares, because that way the bishop can get to it. And if you have the black pieces, make sure your pawn stays on the light square, because the dark square bishop cannot get to it. So let's keep going. Rook to e for attacking the pawn on c4. Bishop attacks the rook. Rook goes to c to d4. Captures the pawn. King attacks the bishop. King bishop moves back. Captures the pawn back. Rook attacks the pawn. Have to defend the pawn. The rook captures back. Bishop attacks the pawn on a2. He plays b3. Of course, the idea of b3 is to actually stop the bishop from trying to get into the position. Not that even if the bishop gets to c2, it's going to be of any help. But anyway, b3 is played. King comes to e7. King to e3. King goes to d5 and e6. King captures pawn. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4. But it's not such a big deal, like I said earlier, because of the opposite colored bishops. Now, if we had a rook on the board, or we have a knight, it's a different ball game. All of a sudden, white's chances of winning the game increases. Why? Because with a knight, you can always, you can always jump to so many squares. You can actually alternate between two squares, colored like the light square and the dark square. And of course, if it's a rook, the winning chances increases. Not that it's going to be one position, because even in rook pawn ending, sometimes it can be one pawn or two pawns up, and your opponent can easily hold the draw if he or she is fast and knows their endgame technique. But when you have a situation where opposite colored bishop is not the case, the chances of a draw really, really increases. Even if you're two pawns up, sometimes all the bishop has to do is blockade your pawns, and there is nothing you can do about that. So g6 is played, king c3, a6 is played, king to d3, king to f5, king to e3, stopping the king from entering the white 6th position. King back to e6, king to d3, king f5, king e3, and after the move king e6, the game ended in a draw. So, like from White's point of view, White wasn't really looking to fight, like to create some imbalance, to try to create situations where he can get away. He actually pretty peaceful in this game, so nothing really much to talk about. Even though he has a pawn up, like I said, because of the opposite colored bishops, this game ended in a draw. Okay, so we are going to move to the very next game they played, which is the game 6. This is another interesting game. Let us get right into that real quickly. So the game 6 was played, and this was another draw. Although in this situation, White Dingley had the white pieces. So let us get right to it quickly. The move went d4, knight f6, bishop to f4, the London system. So Dingley is taking Gukesh to London for this game. So let us see what happens. d5, e3, e6, knight to f3, c5. Of course, in the London system, this is a very important move. What's the point of the move? We want to put pressure on the pawn on d4, 1. We want to try to put pressure on the pawn on b2. Why? Because bishop on f4, that was supposed to be on c1, is no longer on the c1 square. And of course, by moving the pawn, you create opportunities for your queen to get around, either to the b6 square or the a5 square. And most importantly, also putting pressure on the pawn on d4. So c3 is played. Bishop to d6. Of course, that's a very normal move in the London system for the black pieces. You want to trade off every piece that's trying to keep an eye on the e5 square. You want to try to limit the amount of hold white has on that e5 square. Bishop to b5 check, knight to c6, bishop takes, pawn takes back, bishop takes, queen to a for threatening nothing, castles, queen a3 threatening, there's a capture of a pawn, knight d7 protects the pawn. And the thing about the knight e4 protecting the pawn is it's not just protecting the pawn, but it's also protecting the queen. So that means I can easily capture here. If you capture back, I take. If you then take back, I can take back either the e pawn or the c pawn. I think I prefer the c pawn so that I can use the c file. So let's see what happened here. A knight d2, trying to get the knight off the e4 square so that the pawn on c5 is hanging. e5. Immediately black plays e5. Interesting move, because with the move e5, there's more pressure on the d4 pawn, and of course now the bishop can get into the game. Knight takes on e4, pawn captures back, queen takes on c5, queen goes to g6, threatening bishop, threatening to just capture the pawn on g2. And if castles, we have bishop to h3, threatening checkmate, and if you advance the pawn, bishop takes rook, and then all of a sudden black is winning. But if you look at the position, I think it's pretty even, but I'm going to give a slight edge to black just because he has a bishop in a position that can easily get open. But let's see if black can make anything out of this. So knight d2 was played, queen takes g2, castles long. Now this is interesting. So white is pretty much saying, you know what, I want to fight. I'm going to create some imbalance. I'm going to see what I can get from this position. Now he's giving up a pawn, the g2 pawn. Now the good thing for this for white is because the g2 pawn, without the g2 pawn, he has an easy access to the g7 square, which is only defended by the king. So the g7 square could be a very, very big problem for the black king. So what are the things black has in return? Of course, black is a pawn up. He also has the b file that he can use against the white king. So let us see how this game continues. Queen takes another pawn. Say, you know, I'm going to keep taking this pawn. If you keep giving me this pawn, I'm going to keep taking this pawn. Takes pawn on e5, rook to b. Immediately the rook starts to put pressure on the b2 square. If you have the white pieces, you have to be worried because we have one direct attack and we have one indirect attack. So that means you cannot move this knight right now because it's going to be queen takes b2, game over. So the knight is tied to the d2 square because of the mid threat. The queen is on a very aggressive square. So white has to create some play very quickly. You know, like I said, the g7 square is the only square white can really try to make some play on. But apart from the g7 square, I'm not so sure because white is down a couple of pawns if we look at the position. So rook to b8 is played. Knight to c4. Oh, the knight moves. But the knight is not just moving, it's also moving to a square where the pawn on b2 is defended. Now we can try to force this queen off the square either with the d rook will be better. You don't want to move the h rook because you're going to lose another pawn and then you're going to have to worry about this two connected pass pawns. So knight c4 is played. Bishop to e6 immediately hits the knight on c4. It's so important we have to get rid of the queen, keeping an eye, putting pressure on the b2 square. Because if we don't do that, we can get into trouble very quickly. So rook to d2 is played. Queen f3, hanging around, attacking the rook on h1. Rook goes to e1, protecting the pawn on e3. Bishop takes e4. Queen takes e4. Now, this is why the rook had to go to e1, because after the bishop takes, it pulls the queen away from the c5 square where it's protecting the pawn to capture. Now, we don't have to worry about the e3 because we have a rook defending it. So white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. So white's actually up a pawn. So let's keep going. Queen to f5, threatening the pawn on c5. Queen captures on c6. Queen captures on e5. Queen to d3. Now, white has a majority on the queen side. That means if white can trade queens off the board, he can have a chance of creating a 2 against 0, which is going to be very strong for white in the endgame. And of course, black has the majority on the king side, but the danger of trying to use your majorities because you're going to have to expose your king at some point in time, and you don't want to do that. If you expose your king, you might get in trouble. So if you have the black pieces there, you want to actually keep your queen on board for as long as possible. Why? So that you can make sure this pawn does not move, because the pawn move, the king gets exposed. You cannot move your pawns with the queen on the board. You're going to get in trouble. So queen goes to e7. Queen d6 says, please, I beg, let's exchange. He says, no, not today. I don't want to exchange. He says, please, I really want us to, because I don't want your queen on the board. He says, no, I really don't want to either. So he says, I'm going to keep going after your queen. Is that we exchange or we call it truce? So it goes back to d5. He goes to h4, threatening the rook on e1. Rook goes to d1. Okay, that's good. Every piece white has is defending each other like this. The only things white has worried about is the e3 pawn, which is undefended, and the a2 pawn, which is undefended. The b2 pawn, we don't have to worry about that because we have the rook protecting that. All the other pieces are looking good. It would be suicidal for black to try to create a pass pawn on the king's side. Even though he has the 2 against 1, you're going to expose this king and you're going to get in trouble. Which will also be the same thing for the white pieces. Trying to advance your pawn in this situation wouldn't make a lot of sense, unless the queens are off the board. So let's keep going. g6 is played, queen to e5. I won't be surprised if he's still threatening to exchange this guy, So rook goes to e8, or queen g3 is even better, So yeah, you still can exchange, because once you exchange, the king can move, and then you can start moving your pawn. So your pawns might even get to the queen square faster than the black, because here the rooks here can actually keep these pawns in check. Meanwhile, with your king in the middle of the pawns on the queen side, it's going to be hard to keep the pawns here in check. So it's very important for black not to exchange pieces, especially the queen. Queen c5, queen puts pressure on a2, pawn push to a3, queen goes to b5, keeping an eye on the weak b3 square. Rook goes to d4, putting pressure on the pawn on e4. Queen goes to e2. What's the plan of that? And if you take twice here, I can take here, and then I have 3 against 0. So yeah, if you get my pawn, I get your pawn. So rook d2 says, no, I don't want you to get this, but I'm trying to get that. Of course, he has a check. Oh, he doesn't have a check. He just simply attacks the queen. So he moves the king forward. Queen captures, pawn captures back. f5. Now it makes a lot of sense to play f5. Like I said, earlier we couldn't really try to move the pawns in front of the king, because if we do that, we might end up exposing our king while the queen's on board, and that's going to be, that would be such a good idea. So after the move f5, h4 is played. Now, h4 is played for a couple of reasons. Number one, to slow down the h6, g5 pawn push. If black cannot create a pass pawn right here, right now, he's going to have some difficulties. And I think white can really start moving his pawn. Like I said, the queens are off the board, so there's nothing wrong for white to do that. So he plays d6, distraction, forcing this rook to come behind the pawn. So the rook does threaten to take the pawn. It's so important to bring the rook to e7 or even e6. What I think e7 is better. We don't want to lose a tempo defending the pawn on a7. And the idea of this rook e7 is to get the other rook in the game behind to protect the pawn in case there's a double attack on the pawn on e3. And that's exactly what happened. King to d3, rook f to e8, h3, trying to break the pawn chain. Anytime you're playing against the pawn chain, you want to break it. And if you have one, you want to keep it. Trying to break the pawn chain. If white can succeed in breaking the pawn chain, anytime you have doubled pawns, even if you have 1 pawn, 2 pawn, 3 pawn, 4 pawns on the same file, it counts as 1 pawn in an endgame situation. I repeat, anytime you have double pawns in an endgame situation, those pawns either might be 1, 2, 3, 4, it counts as 1. So it won't be a good idea for black to capture the pawn on h5, because then it just has 1 pawn here, 2, 3, 4 against white. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 pawns. But the double pawns is just not a good idea for you, especially when you're in the endgame. So he captures the pawn, rook attacks the pawn on f5, rook starts to move the pawn on h6, on the h file. The idea is just to distract the white pieces away so that the pawn on e3 can move. So it captures the pawn, rook checks, king goes to c2, king moves to h to g7, rook check, king goes back. You have to stop the pawn from moving. You have to blockade the pawn. Remember, a pass pawn, which is the pawn we have on e3, is a dangerous criminal that has to be kept on the lock and key all the time. So rook e2 is played, and king comes out. Rook check to check, king goes back in. After the rook e2, king g7, and the game ended in a draw. So another, I won't say such a peaceful draw, but it's still a draw. Both players tried to create winning chances, but it was not meant to be. So that is it for the recap for the games 5 and 6. We are going to come to you with the 7th game as soon as possible. And of course, please, if you have any questions, any comments about this game, kindly put it in the chat. And thanks for the people that reached out to me that mentioned some things about the video, how the videos can be much better. The lightning, the voice, everything is appreciated. All critics are appreciated. Okay, thanks for now. See you soon, and take care, and God bless.